Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Yubet. This month's learning is sponsored in loving memory of Shai Uriel ben Karmit and Rav Shimon Pizam and Ayam Mavorach ben Shiri Chaya and Mordechai Mati Twito that fell by serving our country. This week's learning is sponsored by Nira Feldman in loving memory of Faye Derek Zichronat Bracha, Finkel Baruch Vadina in commemoration of her first year at site. She was also a Hadran learner, and we miss her at our activities. Okay. We are going to start with a review of what we were up to. We started with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah discusses a case with an animal running through, if you remember. And basically, we say that the chatzer of the owner, the courtyard of the owner, basically acquires this for the owner. And then Shmuel said, but wait, if it's a chatzer that's not protected, then the owner has to be next to the field in order for this to work. Ula said the same thing. Rabbi Abba questioned Ula and said, how could this be? Because we have another source with Rabban Gamliel, a Mishna, where he gives his maaser to the rabbis. He gives them his courtyard, and he basically says, oh, the maaser will be yours, acquire it this way, give me money to rent the space in my courtyard, and with that you'll acquire it, even though they were clearly in a boat far away from the field. To which we have one possible answer. That was Kinyan Agav, this is different. But the second possibility was Rav Papa. Rav Papa said it all depends on whether there's two people in the transaction. When one person is passing on to somebody else, like Rabban Gamliel, you don't need to be next to the field because it's much easier to pass something from one person to the other. But when it's an ownerless item that you're trying to acquire and there's nobody passing that ownerless item to you, you have to be there. To which they asked, what? And then they brought Rabbi Yomi. If you remember, we're actually going to repeat Rabbi Yomi. I'll go back to him later today, but in the beginning of today's daf. But Rabbi Yomi showed that there's really this distinction between someone giving a gift and someone doing, acquiring something through hefker. That this dad acheret makneh is a significant difference, and I said we've already talked about this before earlier in the Masechet. Now they said, but what about get? I don't understand. Okay, so let's go back to that issue. We said get. There's someone else, there's a husband passing the get to the wife, and it only works according to Ula if the woman is standing next. If the husband puts the get in her courtyard or in her house, it only works if she's standing nearby. Now, according to Rav Papa, if there's somebody else, it should work. To which they said, well, and I had trouble understanding this yesterday, but I researched it a little, I thought about it more, and maybe I have an explanation. Get is different because she can receive it against her will. So why does that matter? Well, again, we're going to reject this in 1 second and say all the more so. She shouldn't need to be there. But the assumption is that if a woman can get divorced against her will, at least she needs to be there when it happens. In other words, giving it against her will means she's not really a player. But if she can accept it against her will and you stick it in her garden and she doesn't even know about it and it can be done against her will, she has to have some part in it, which is interesting. It's kind of a little bit counterintuitive, and that's what the Gemara is going to say. What do you mean? She doesn't have to have any part of it, then she certainly doesn't need to be there. But I think the logic is, since she's getting this possibly against her will, we at least want her there in order to accept it, right? That she has to have some sort of presence here. Since her presence isn't in, let's put it this way, her presence is not in the acceptance of it, but therefore she has to at least have presence when it's put into her courtyard. To which we ended with Matkif la Rashesh braita Rav Idi, or Rashesh braita Rav Idi said, what are you talking about? We would assume the opposite. Is it not a kavachomer? Uma geti te bal korcha, right? If this is the end of Yud Aleph Amabet, if she can accept the get against her will, then meaning we don't really need her, and yet we require her to be omedet, right? She's not really a player in this transaction. Then he omedet b'tzad b'tzad chatzera in lo, and yet we require her presence in a matana, in a gift, where she could say, I don't want this gift, and then the gift won't be a gift. Lo kol shekain, right? Don't we need her there to be there? So we reject this answer for the get, and we're still stuck with if get is dad acheret makneh. And Rav Papa is saying basically, as soon as we have dad acheret, we have somebody else passing the object. We need your presence there. Well, I'm sorry, we don't need your presence. So why in get do we need her presence? To which Elam Rav Ashi answers like this. Chatzer itor by mishum yad. We already learned that. Why is her chatzer kone? If you put the get into her courtyard, and the husband puts the get in the courtyard, It's kona because it's an extension of her hand. The logar mishlichut. It's no worse than a shaliach. Now remember, we have the whole thing. Is chatzer mishum yad and mishum shlichut. We said it's mishum yad, but it's no worse than her own shaliach, meaning it at least operates like a messenger, like an agent. Now, why does that matter? Well, now we're going to understand the difference between, again, we have to distinguish between get and a gift. Okay, a gift, when someone else gives it to you, you don't need to be there, but a get you do. Why is that? And this is a very simple principle that we've learned many times and we will learn many times. A get is bad for the woman. Why is it bad for the woman, right? Some divorced women might say, and probably many of them might say, it's actually good to be divorced, right? They want to be divorced, but, or they're, we're in a marriage they don't want to be in and they're happy to be out of it. But what they're saying here is certainly in Talmudic times, it was definitely considered a chov. It was not good for the woman to be divorced. Okay, the woman ends up left, by herself. And we've seen many times, most of the commentaries say the reason why it's a chov is because of this line that we always struggle with or wonder, is it still true today? Tov l'meitav tandumi l'meitav or melo. A woman would always rather live with two than live by herself. Women would much prefer to be married, and therefore it's considered a chov. So what if it's a chov? It's not good for her. Well, there's a principle. Ein chavim la'adam ela b'fanav. You can't do something that's bad for someone without them being there. Okay, you can't do a transaction on behalf of someone, use an agent, let's say. Here, I'm, taking away something from this person without them being there. Okay, can't do that. But matana is chutulo, but a gift, which is good for somebody. Zachin adam shelo b'fanav. I can gift something to you by giving it to somebody else and say, can you acquire it on your, can they acquire it on your behalf? Why can I do that? Because it's good for you. Even though theoretically, right, we just said a minute ago, you could say, I don't want the gift, but it doesn't matter. I can actually make it yours. You can decide, I don't want it. I want to give it back. But it technically already is in your domain as soon as I give it to somebody else, even if you're not there. And that's why Dan acheret makneh works when it's his zchut, when it's good for the person. But it doesn't work if it's bad. And that's why the get is an exception to the rule. And with that, we resolve our issue. And now moving on. Gufa. So the Mishnah had said, right, they're running after this Metzia, and right, it goes through your property. And then we have Rabbi Yirmiyah who commented on that on Rabbi Yochanan. This only works if the animal, this lame animal, is wandering through your field and you are standing near the field. It becomes yours as long as potentially you could have reached the animal. If the animal was going too fast and you had no way of catching up to them and they would have jumped out of your field somehow, well, that doesn't work. Okay, it's not yours. It has to be that potentially you could reach the animal. But by Rabbi Yirmiyah, and this is just a quote from yesterday's daf, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, "Matana heya, would the same thing be true for a gift? If you give me a gift, and again, this is where we built the whole distinction between, this is where Rav Papa proved, the distinction between matana, where someone's giving you something, and hefker, when you're accepting something that's ownerless. So, b'matana heya, Rabbi Abba Bar Kana, he accepted Rabbi Yirmiyah's question, saying, you're right, a matana is different. If somebody gifts you an animal and the animal runs out of your field, the animal is yours as soon as it entered your field, even though you now can't catch up to it. It's running too fast for you. It's still yours because somebody else gave it to you. And that's easier to acquire than when there isn't somebody else. Okay, that was just a quote. Now we get to Rava's question, which even though we're going to try to have an answer, in the end, we're not going to be able to answer his question. By Rava. Zarak arnaki bepetach zeh, v'yatza bepetach acher mahu. What if somebody's giving away their money and they take their wallet full of money and they throw it into the airspace of your house? But they have a very good throw and it goes in one door and out the other. Well, avir she'ein sofo lanuach kimunach dami. If it goes through your house in a way that it's never going to actually land on the ground in your house, well, since it went through the airspace of your house, is it as if it landed on the ground? Now, you might remember this kind of question. When did we have this question? It was a while ago. In Masechet Shabbat. I think we actually had it in a recent Masechet. I can't remember where, but they quoted it. In any case, the big question in Masechet Shabbat is, when you pass something 4 cubits in the public domain, you're liable for, you basically did something wrong on Shabbat. Now, what's the issue? If you take this item, throw it in Reshut Rabim, in order to be liable for moving an object 4 cubits in the public domain, you have to have an akira, an uprooting of it, and a hanachan. It has to land somewhere. So, or it's from domain to domain. So what if it went through airspace, but didn't land there? The whole language there is kluta kamishun chadamya olo, is being in the airspace as if it landed. So then you'd be liable for the landing, okay, or not. Now, the commentaries say it doesn't matter what we say there. Even if we say that it's as if it landed, we might be more stringent because of Shabbat there, because by saying it landed, it actually makes you obligated. That's a stringency by Shabbat. You wouldn't necessarily apply the same rules for acquiring an object that was ownerless. Okay, you could see a reason to distinguish. So let's put that aside, but I wanted to mention it because I imagine some of you might have remembered that. So that's his question. Do we view this as if it landed in my property? Let's say it goes through my house and I'm the owner of it. Or do we say, look, it's right now outside my property. It's ownerless. Anyone can pick it up. Okay, either Rav Papa answered, or Rav Adbarman answered, or Ravina answered. They were going to, one of them offered this answer. We don't know who. Lav hainu manitin, isn't that our Mishnah? That's our case. They're running through your field. It's kind of like the same thing as the wallet running through your field. Okay, same idea. Va'am, or your house, either which way. Va'am Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yochanan. Now, what's the relevance here, though? It's going to be a little different for the case in our Mishnah. Okay, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'usha ratza charehenu migian. You have to actually be able to reach it. Where here, obviously, you couldn't catch the wallet, otherwise you would have. Ubai Rabbi Yirmiyah b'matanaheya. But Rabbi Yirmiyah said, what's this case of a gift, though? Even if you chase it and you don't reach it, it's still yours. Now, why is this similar to a gift? Well, it's similar because what was unique about a gift, right? On one hand, this is ownerless, right? Because the guy's basically throwing his wallet in the air and saying, I don't want it anymore. On the other hand, there's a person on the other side. This isn't like an animal that there has no owner and is running through your field, but somebody threw it into your house. So because there's somebody else there, it's actually like a gift. And then it shouldn't matter if you could reach it or not, and it should be counted as yours. Simple answer. Or maybe not. Amar le, Rava says to them, no, it's obviously not that. Because mitgalgel ka'amarta, that rolled on the ground. Now, it's not exactly rolled, but the animal, his feet touched the ground. The animal was running on your land. That's not the same. Shani mitgalgel de kimunach dami. Even though it was running and it wasn't stationary on your land, it was touching your land, your property, your ground. But this thing just went through your airspace. And my whole question was about how do we view airspace? And therefore, we're left with a question and we don't have an answer. Okay, new Mishnah. This is a very clear-cut, classic Mishnah style where we have two lists that are parallel one to the other. And the halacha in the first case is going to be one thing, and the halacha in the second group of cases is going to be different. Metzia b'no b'toach tanim. We're now talking about somebody picks up a lost item, who acquires it. So if, again, we're talking about a lost item that's ownerless, that nobody wants anymore, not the kind you're going to need to return, which again, we're going to get all those rules in the second chapter. Metzia b'no b'toach tanim. So we have a lost item that a child finds. We assume right now it means b'no b'toach tanim is used in the classic sense, and I say this because someone's going to explain it not that way. But right now we're going to understand it as we're talking about minor children under the age of mitzvot, right, which we understand is 12, 13. In those days, it's kind of dependent on for what purpose, but let's just leave it at that. Child, a young child finds an object on the ground, or mitziat avdo v'shipchato knanim, or Canaanite slaves find an object, or mitziat ishto, or your wife finds an object, hare elu shelo. They're yours, meaning if you have young children, they pick up a lost item on the ground, it goes to you. You have slaves, Canaanite slaves, okay, and I'm not giving the reason for the children, we're going to get to that momentarily, but the Canaanite slaves, we know already, we've learned this many times, gufo kanoi. This is a strange kind of slavery. If you're new to Gemara and you haven't been learning all the previous Masechtot with us, we've talked about Canaanite slaves. They were a certain type of slave that kind of lived in your house. They had a brit milah. They had to be partially sort of semi-Jewish. They kept mitzvot that aren't time bound. and they basically were acquired by you. You own you own them. So because you own them, again, hard for us to understand in our day and age, but there was such a thing. In fact, the commentators all talk about this doesn't exist anymore, right? For many, many years, this hasn't existed, but there was at that time this type of thing. They were owned by you, and therefore everything that was theirs went straight to you. So likewise, they're lost items. If your wife finds something, also goes to you. Why is that? We learned about this in ketubot, in gitin, because since you give her mezonot, you feed her, the husband feeds the wife, therefore, if her Metzia she would take for herself, it would cause enmity between them. And therefore, we don't want to create bad relationship between them and fighting, as we call it, shalom bayit, right? For shalom bayit purposes, we basically say, just let the husband have the Metzia so it doesn't create tension, where he feels like I'm supporting you and you're taking things you find on the street. We'll see later if the children relate to this as well. Okay, in the beginning, we're not going to, but later it could be yes. So now that's the first group. The second group is Mitziat beno bito agdolim. Okay, here we're going to go to all the parallels. We have, instead of young children, older children. Mitziat avdo v'shipchato ha'ivrim, Jewish slaves, who we know are not owned by the owner, right? They go free after 6 years. Torah spells all that out. Mitzia, and they're not owned by you. They work for you, but they're not owned by you. So therefore, they keep their own items. Mitziat ishto shegirsha afal pi shelo natan ketubata, opposed to a wife. The wife that you divorced, even if you didn't yet give her the ketuba, still her money is her own, and therefore she gets it. Later, the Gemara is going to say, isn't this obvious? Of course, if she's divorced, she gets it. They're going to understand this case a little differently. Anyway, elu shalahen. All those people get to keep the object for themselves. We'll have to deal with the shivcha ivriya also. It's not so clear. And the Eved Ivri, we're going to have questions on all of these. Oh, Amar Shmuel. But the first part of our daf, the majority of our daf, is really on this line. Shmuel says, why does the child's lost item go to the father? Because typical behavior of children, if they find something, they come home, they show their father, look what I found, and they give it to their father. Okay, that's typical behavior. Because it's typical behavior, we're going to say that when the child acquired it, they acquired it for the father. Now, this leads the Gemara to make a certain assumption, which will help us to better understand Shmuel and why he says this, and what the meaning of him having said this. Lememra, and they're basically raising it as a question, but first they're making an assumption about Shmuel. Lememra desavar Shmuel katan leit leschia lenafshe midoraita. And then they're going to say, but Shmuel says otherwise. But right now, let's just understand what they're assuming Shmuel says. They're going to say, basically, Shmuel must hold that a minor who picks something up does not acquire it by Torah law. Because if they acquired it by Torah law, it would be theirs. We wouldn't, because of most kids bring lost items to their fathers to show them, wouldn't be enough of a reason to basically say, what you acquired, we're taking away and we're giving to your father. If by Torah law they really have, that means that it's theirs, 100%. Hard to make a takana on that and say, well, we're giving it to the father for some not such important reason. But if we say that a katan, and this is what they're assuming Shmuel holds, a katan, a minor, doesn't have the rights to acquire any item on his own by Torah law or her own. But what? The rabbi said we're going to, and this actually we saw in Gitin, and we're going to see it quoted soon, which is mipnei darkei shalom. They said that if a child finds a lost item on the ground and picks it up, if somebody steals it, we're basically, because of darkei shalom, we're going to give that kid rights, because otherwise we're going to create a society where kids pick things up, people grab from their hands, and they're not held accountable. That creates a bad society. So because of that, the rabbis instituted that children will be able to acquire items, but because their acquiring only comes from a takana of the rabbis, so we'll say that it goes to the father, okay? That already is a much more easier to understand sentence. So therefore, they assume that Shmuel must say, by Torah law, they can't acquire things. But this is not going to work with the following source. V'hatanya. Now, before we get into the source, we're going to learn about leket. What is leket? Leket is when you're working in the fields and you drop some of your bundles while you're collecting them, you have to leave them, again, depending on the numbers, but let's not get into that right now. You leave them. You can't pick them up while you're working. Okay, so now here comes our case. We have a socher tapoel. You hire a worker to work in your field, and your worker drops some of the bundles, yeleket b'no acharav. If he brought his son to work with him, the son can pick up the bundles. Seems a little weird, and we're going to try to figure this out, how this can work. Lemetza l'shlishu l'revia, but if, now, you'd have to assume the poel is a poor person, because leket is only for poor people. So the son is allowed to collect it. But if you work lemetza l'shlishu l'revia, but you're a sharecropper, and you get a percentage of the land, lo yelakeh b'no acharav. Then your son can't collect for you. Okay, first of all, some people say you're wealthy then. Only wealthy people were sharecroppers. Some people say, no, you could even be poor, but you're considered a part owner of the field. Because you're a part owner of the field, because you get a percentage, you can't have your child collect the leket for you. But the real thing that's going to interest us is Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Rabbi Yossi says, Bein kach ubein kach, yelakeh b'no v'ishto acharav. He adds it even the wife. Either way, whether you're a sharecropper, whether you're a worker, a day worker, it doesn't matter. Your wife, your child, they can all collect for you. Now, Amar Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel says the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Now, let's try to figure out how on earth this could work. If you say by Torah law, a child can acquire things for themselves, then it makes perfect sense. The child picks it up, it's for them. It's not for the father. Now, if we give it to the father later, fine, we give it to the father later because, the rabbis instituted it goes to the father, but really the child picked it up for themselves. And that's why this is allowed, because you can't possibly have it, right? Therefore, he accepted it, the child accepted it for themselves. And then through that, it then gets given to the father. But which is what we thought Shmuel held. If a child doesn't have rights to collect on a Torah level, well, then on a Torah level, it's no different than the father collecting, because the child has no rights to collect, which basically means that when the child collects, it basically goes straight to the father. It never really went to the child in the first place, which means that it's basically like the father collecting himself. So how could that possibly work? Rav Ashi, because the father is a wealthy person who can't collect leket. Now, this could be understood in two ways. Either we're assuming the father is wealthy, but we say the kid is poor because the kid doesn't, if the kid has, it actually works together. The kid has his own money, right? He can acquire things on his own. Then actually we say the kid is as wealthy as the kid's bank account. The kid probably doesn't have a big bank account, and therefore the kid is poor, even if the father's wealthy. That's one way to read it. Or you could say, no, he can't collect it because he's a sharecropper and he owns part of the land. In other words, he owns percentage of the land, which basically puts him as an owner of the property. He can't collect his own leket. Right? You can't collect your own property. Either way, you understand. Now, so how on earth could his wife or child collect for him? So now we're stuck because Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi must be premised on the fact that a child can acquire things on a Torah level. Otherwise, how on earth could the kid collect leket and then it ends up going to the father? Only if we say the child, there's two stages. The child first can collect it for their own sake, and then, okay, well, then he has to give it to the father because that's the rules. But if he has his own rights by Torah level to collect it, that would work. So we're stuck with Shmuel because we assumed when Shmuel explained the Tana in our Mishna, sounded like the assumption, and nobody thinks that that's not true. The assumption of what he said was that children don't have rights, and that's why they don't have rights by Torah law, since it's only rabbinic. That's why we can just say, oh, but it goes to the father. It's very easy to move that if he doesn't actually have his own rights to it. If he really has rights to it by Torah law, it's very hard to then say we're going to always give it to the father because of this takana that most kids give lost items to their fathers. So answer number one, we're going to have three answers. Answer number one is Shmuel ta'ama detana didan kamar v'leilo svirale. When Shmuel said that about the Mishnah, he was just explaining the Mishnah, but he doesn't hold that way. In other words, there's two approaches. One, and which we see in the braita also, there's two approaches. So Shmuel thinks that really a child does acquire things by Torah level. He was saying that the Tan of our Mishnah thinks not. And he was explaining why does the Tan of our Mishnah think that a minor's stuff goes to the father. But he wouldn't agree with that. Okay, but this answer is going to be a little problematic, and they're going to ask the question in a bit of a different way, which is, well, that assumes that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi holds that by Torah law, it's acquired, and that's the whole reason why the leket works, because the child acquires it by Torah law, and then can later give it back to the father, but he can acquire it in the first place. Rabbi Yossi katan itles chiyamido, right? Wait a minute. But Rabbi Yossi himself doesn't hold, and we know this for a fact, that Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold that a child can acquire things by Torah level, in which case we're going to resolve the contradiction by saying, oh, it actually doesn't contradict, because he actually doesn't hold that way. And then we're going to have to say, well, then why does it work in leket? Okay, so now we're going to flip the question to more, not what's the problem with our Mishnah, Shmuel's explanation on our Mishnah, but more like, how does this leket case work? Why does the child acquire it? We thought it's because the child acquires it because the child can acquire things by Torah law, but it's not. And we're going to have two different explanations to why, even according to Rabbi Yossi, the child can acquire. First, we have to show how we know Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold that a child can acquire things by Torah law. So that's because we're going to quote the Mishnah in Gitin. This is what I said before. According to Tanakama, if a child or a deaf mute or a shoteh basically picks up an item, you can't steal it from them because that creates a bad society. Rabbi Yossi Omer Gezel Gamor. Rabbi Yossi says this is really theft. It's not just because of darkish shalom. It's really theft. To which makes it sound like what we thought, which is because why would it be really theft? Because they really can acquire. But Amar Rav Chisda don't understand him literally, and this is going to create the problem. Gezel Gamor midivrehem. It means this is really theft on a rabbinic level, not on the Torah level. They don't acquire by Torah law. And nafkamina. So what's the difference of saying it's darkei shalom or it's gezel midorabanan? Either which way, it's rabbinic. Well, lahotzia b'dayanim. Basically, according to Tanakama, don't steal from a chereshoter or katan because it's not the right thing to do. But if you steal, we can't really enforce it. Comes from Yossi and he says, no, this is really theft. Now, theft on a rabbinic level, but to the extent that the rabbis, if you steal it, the rabbis will take it away from you and give it back to them. Okay, that's the difference between it. But everybody thinks it's rabbinic. So now we have to explain the leket case. So why can the kid collect it? If they only acquire by rabbinic law and the rabbi said, well, the acquiring goes straight to the father, then how on earth could the child collect the leket on behalf of the father? So Ella Amra by Asa'ua Kemisha Chuban Nimoshot. It's a very weird interpretation. The Gemara is going to question it right away, or Rav Rabbanit is going to question this. But there's a halacha about leket and pe'ah and all those matnoranim that right in the beginning, it's left for the poor people. But after the last of the people walk through and basically no one's collecting it anymore, well, at that point, it becomes open to anybody. Anyone can accept it. So basically what they're saying is this case when the child is walking behind the father is like that case. Now, it's not the case where everybody stopped, right? It's not a case where X amount of time passed and nobody was coming anymore and therefore it turned to hefker. So how could you possibly say this? Well, when you go into the field as a worker and you bring your child with you, everybody gives up on ever getting anything. Why is that? Because everybody knows they've already given up on this because they know your child's going to collect everything you drop behind. And therefore, because they know that, they basically give up on it. Now, again, what happens? Who's this owned by? It's really owned by no one, right? But it's given to all poor people. Now, if all poor people say there's no way we're going to pick this up because we know there's not going to be any left, then basically it becomes ownerless. And that's when anyone can take it. And that's why the child can take it for the father. So then they say, is someone allowed to put up, like a scarecrow, but a lion for people, right? Not to scare the crows, but to scare people away. Put up a lion and say, oh, well, now it's everyone's going to not want to come into this field to collect the poor people's stuff, because there's a lion in my field, and therefore I can take it back for my own sake. Of course, you can't do that. And that's basically what this person is doing. So that doesn't make any sense. Ela Amar Rava, turning now to Amar Bet. Asu she'eno zoche kezoche. They made it, the rabbis made it, that it's like someone who can't really get it, can get it. Now, why did they institute this? Now, what we're going to say basically is this is in the interest of poor people. My time, it's good for the poor people. In other words, let's say I'm a poor person and I see you in the field with your son collecting the stuff that you drop. And I say, oh, that's not fair. Like, what about me? But I don't say that. Why not? I want this to work for you. Why do I want it to work for you? Because if it'll work for you, it'll work for me. And a lot of poor people worked as day workers in the fields collecting, or as sharecroppers. So if the rabbi said like this, if we allow it for this person, we can allow it for that person, and it's in everybody's best interest because it's a great way for them to collect the leket. So therefore, the rabbis instituted that this was okay to do. Okay, and that's what we're basically saying. So let's go back for a minute. We started with Shmuel, who said that the Metzia katan goes to the father because that's typically what kids do. We basically assume that must mean a kid can't acquire something by Torah law. We said, what about the leket case? It looks like he does acquire it. Otherwise, how could he take it on behalf of the father? First answer was Shmuel wasn't talking about his own opinion. He was just explaining the Tanakama, but the Tan of our Mishnah, but he doesn't hold that way. Or we say, no. The leket works based on a different principle, either because it's as if all the people gave up on it because they assume this is what's happening, but then we said that was a little problematic. Or the rabbis instituted that this works. This method works in order to make it easier for poor people to collect the leket, that they would go in with their children, or their wives would collect whatever they dropped. And that was a way they collected their tzedakah money very easily. And it was in the best interest. Right? This is similar to the part about the guy who lifts up the talis, right? By lifting up the talis for the other person and also for themselves, right? Because by them allowing someone else to get rights to half of it, they're allowing themselves to get the rights to their half. So it's similar idea here that I might do something that's not good for me right now because you're taking something, but it's going to be better for me in the long term because I'll get something also. Okay. Now, this whole thing that Shmuel said, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that there might be a different way to understand the Mishnah. We understood the Mishnah that katan means a minor in age, katan in age. So this whole thing of Shmuel that he said, why does the Metzia of a katan go to the father? Because a child really by Torah law doesn't have any rights to accept anything, acquire anything because they're minors. Minors don't have knowledge. Their acquiring is nothing. By rabbinic law, they instituted it counts. So rabbinic law, they said it goes to the father. Well, Rabbi Yochanan, lo gadol gadol mamash, but lo katan katan mamash. This doesn't mean by age. Ela gadol v'samuch shulchan aviv zeu katan. Katan ve'eno samuch shulchan aviv zeu gadol. Gadol and katan here just mean a child who's supported by the parent. You could have a child who's minor and not supported by the parent. They would acquire their own lost item. You could have an older child who lives in the father's house and eats dinner every night with the father, and that child will basically have to give all mitziot to the father, just like the wife. What did we say? Because he's feeding the wife and supports her, the mitziot go to him. Otherwise, it creates fighting, inward fighting. So likewise with a child. If the child is supported by the father, then any mitzvah they find goes to the father. And he has a totally different way of understanding this mission. It has nothing to do with can a katan acquire or not acquire. It sounds like a katan could acquire by Torah law, because if the katan was a child who was not supported by the father, living independently, their mitzvah would go to themselves. Okay, next section. So the first thing we're going to deal with is the eved, and then we're going to get to the shipcha. Eved, remember, is an eved who works for 6 years. Basically, he does whatever the master wants, which is going to create a contradiction to a source we already saw. You might have thought about it, but if not, here goes. Amai, why? Why does it go to himself? Lo yehe ela poel. Isn't he like a worker? And what do we learn about a worker? Vitanya, mitziat poel atzmo. Okay, a poel gets to keep his own thing. That so far works well. If I said, do a particular job for me today, then you do that job. And if you find a lost item, you get it. But if I say, do whatever I need today, you're my errand boy for the day, or my errand girl, mitzia tola balabayit. Anything you find goes to the owner. Now, why is this? So we're going to talk about it. Seems to be that if I tell you, do everything for me today, if you stop to go get some lost item, that's my time. You're supposed to be working for me all day long, doing whatever I need. So if you take a break from your work in order to go acquire this lost item, let's say it takes 5 minutes, pick it up, put it in a safe place, that's time that you're on my clock. So anything you do on my clock is mine. Okay, this is going to be important to understanding when we understand the resolutions to this problem. So we have a contradiction. And Eved Ivri is like a poel, and he's even more. He's more owned by you, right? He's not really owned by you, but he is living in your house for 6 years, doing anything you need. So if he stops to go pick up a lost item, of course it should go to you. So why does the Mishnah say it doesn't? So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to have three answers, just like before we had three answers. Seems to be the theme for today. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Hacha be'eved nokev margaliot askina. Okay, when the Mishnah was talking, when the Mishnah said the Eved Ivri gets to keep it, okay, the first two answers are going to explain uniquely the case in the Mishnah. The last answer is going to explain the case about in the braita. But the case in our Mishnah where we said it goes to him is talking about someone who works with pearls, okay? And they're making holes in pearls. It's a very specialized job. It's worth a lot of money. Every minute you work is worth a lot of money. You don't want, if I tell you work as an okev margaliyot, there's two ways to read this, by the way. Then you could say it's like nakeshi miyayom, right? It's more like the case where I say do a particular job where you get to keep your lost item. But because they say she'em rabo rotzeh l'shanotol l'melacha acheret, what the commentaries say is what's going on here is if I hire you as your work you're doing is very highly specialized and you make a lot of money every minute, and then you find some lost item which isn't worth as much money, I don't want you to stop your work. So now if you stop your work, this is kind of counterintuitive, but if you stop working for me and go do something else, that's not what I wanted you to do. If it's what I hired you to do, then it goes to me. But if you use your own mind and say, hey, I don't want to work right now, I'm going to do this for somebody else, then basically you're going to end up, it's going to go to you and not to me, because I didn't hire you to do that. I didn't want you to stop to get the Metzia, so it doesn't go to me. Rava Amal, you're a very good multitasker. And while you're working, what was the whole idea? And that's why I explained it before. When you are working for me and you stop, I say, you're working for me for the whole day. Everything you do, you stop what you're doing and you do something else to pick up a lost item, that's my time. But if you can do your job and at the same time pick up this lost item, then that's on your time, not on my time. Because while you're still working, you pick up the Metzia, right? Let's say you're picking up bundles from the field and under the bundles was a ring. So you just pick them up all at the same time. Well, you're still doing your work for me and yet you got the ring. So the ring is yours. So those are two possible explanations of how to understand the case in the Mishnah, what kind of case of Eved Ivri would go to yourself, but most cases actually would go to the master. But Rav Papa Amar, he gives a different answer. He says the case, and this is a little hard to say that this is what it's talking about, but when the braita says, if you say nakesha miyayom, adoring miyayom, right, hope for me, or gather the stuff for me, if you said that, then the owner gets it. Then they get it for themselves. But if you say work for me for the day, then it all goes to the owner. Well, maybe when it says you work for me for the day, it all goes to the owner is when you work for me in something in particular, meaning kigon shescharo leket metziot. Let's say I hired you to collect lost items. Now, what on earth would that be? You don't generally hire someone to accept lost items. Well, hechidami, to akfe agma bekavle. The water overflowed and there were tons of fish washed up on the shore. And your job for the day was go collect the fish that came up on the shore. So if that's the case, then, the lake overflowed. If that's the case, then I hired you to collect lost items. If I hired you to collect lost items, then all the lost items obviously go to me. And if you explain the braita in that way, then it doesn't contradict the Mishnah, because usually the lost items would go to the master. Would go to the slave, to the worker. It's a Jewish slave, which isn't really a slave, a servant. But anyway, it would go to the worker. But in this case, if I hired you to collect lost items, then it would go to me. That's a bit of a stretch. Okay. We have two more issues before we get to the next Mishnah. Now we want to know about the shipcha. Do you remember the way a shipcha works? A shipcha is a woman under the age of 12 and 2 simanim and 2 signs of puberty. She can be sold by her father to be a slave. Let's say he's very poor. He can sell his daughter to be a slave with the hopes, part of it is maybe they'll marry her, but either which way, she is sold in slavery only until age 12. If they don't marry her at age 12, she goes 12 and 2 simanim and 2 hairs of puberty, she goes free. If they marry her, then she's also not a shipcha. So now we want to understand what's the case. If she already has 2 sarot, what did we say? It goes to her. Well, if she already is of age, my bai gabe. Well, she's not a servant anymore. She's not a slave. She goes free. If she didn't grow 2 hairs, Well, it goes to the father. All minor girls, their stuff goes to their father. And if there is no father, because he died, right? Maybe the case is maybe she has no father because he died. And then she would get her own item. But she goes free if her father dies. How do we know that? Any girl who was sold into slavery by her father, Reish Lakish says if her father dies, she goes free also. So basically, it can't be that the father's dead, and that's why she gets it for herself, because she's no longer a slave anymore. We need to find a case where she's a slave and gets her lost item, and we can't figure out what that would be. So first they say, okay, in the Kavach Homer, we learned in Kiddushin, we're not going to go back to the Kavach Homer, but the Gemara says, V'lavi totiv Reish Lakish, didn't we knock out his Kavach Homer and say it's not true that she goes free at the father's death? To which they say, well, nema mehai nami tave tiyufta. So maybe what they're saying is, our Mishnah can provide a difficulty for Reish Lakish because there is no other way other to say than the father must have died, and maybe she doesn't go free at the father's death, and Reish Lakish is wrong, and that's the case where she's still a slave, and she gets to keep it for herself. To which the Gemara says, no, we have a better explanation. Lo olam di'itelav. The father is in existence. You just misunderstood the Mishnah. My harehin shalahem, when it gives this list of all these people that get to keep their own lost items, in this case it meant lafuke miderabah. It's to say the master doesn't get it. Not the master doesn't get it, but she gets it in her case, though she getting it really means her father gets it. And therefore we reinterpret. It doesn't mean it goes to her herself. It goes to her, meaning not to her master, but to her father. Mitziat ishto. So to which the Gemara says, Gersha Pshita. Obviously, if he divorced her, she gets to keep her own Metzia. What husband has rights to their wife's property when they're divorced? So it's a case where there's a doubt about her divorce. Seen cases like this in Gittin where he throws her the get, and it's safek karov la, safek karov lo, right? We're not sure, did it go in her 4 cubits? Was it in his 4 cubits? So she's safek. The Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Shmuel, kol makom shamru chachamim megureshet ve'ena megureshet, ba'ala chaya b'mezonoteh. The rabbi said he has to feed her in that case. Okay, if we're not sure if she's divorced, he has to give her, provided with sustenance. Now, let's figure out why she gets to keep her Metzia then. And it's not so obvious, because remember, what did we say? Right? If he's supporting her, there's going to create enmity between them if basically she's keeping her Metzia. So, in this case, he wanted to divorce her. So obviously there's already a tension between them. And this isn't going to make it any worse. So therefore, she actually gets to keep it because the reason is irrelevant here. Interesting answer. Okay, new Mishnah. And this is going to start a whole new thing. We find lost promissory notes on the ground. Now, what's the issue? Promissory note, normally the creditor keeps them until they get paid back. Once they get paid back, they either tear it up or it goes to the debtor, and the debtor keeps it to show I paid it back. But what if we find it on the street? We don't know, was it paid back? Was it not paid back? Okay. Or maybe the loan was never even taken. Okay, that's also a possibility. They wrote a document, but never actually did the loan. So what do we do with it? So the Mishnah is not going to be understood yet. If it's connected to property, lien to property, we've seen this many times. If the loan is lien, that means that if the debtor sold land, then based on the date in the star, right, any land they sold from that date, you can go collect that from the buyers, right? Anyone who bought land from the debtor. So if it had a warranty of land, lo yachzir, we don't give it back because Beit Din nifrei mehem, because the Beit Din can go collect it from these people who bought it, and that would be unfair. We don't know why exactly it would be unfair if the loan was actually a valid loan, so we'll have to see. But if they're not lien to property, then there's no concern that the Beit Din will collect it by mistake or something. Again, we don't really know why, so don't worry that we don't understand this. But ein Beit Din nifreim, divrei Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim ben kach lo ben kach lo yachzir. No matter what, we don't give this back to the malveh. Mipnei sheBeit Din nifreim mehem. Either which way, you could end up with a problem. Okay, so let's try to understand this. B'mayaskina. Ilema kishem chayav modeh. If the lova admits, the borrower admits that there's a loan, and they didn't pay back the loan. So, even if it's linked to property, why wouldn't we return it? The lova admits he didn't return the loan. If the lova doesn't admit, the lova says, what are you talking about? I pay back the money. So if the lova claims that he or she paid the money, then what would happen? We can't give it back. Maybe they already paid it. If we give it back to the creditor is going to collect it, and they've already paid back the money. Now, normally we believe the malva, but that's only if the malva produces the shtar. This shtar was found on the ground. We have no idea. And then it shouldn't matter whether it's lien to property or not lien to property. If it doesn't have a warranty on land, so they can't collect it from land, but they're going to go to the lova and take it from the cash he has on hand. So either which way, it doesn't make any sense that we make this distinction. So if the lova doesn't admit, if the lova admits, well, then give it back. If the lova doesn't admit, don't give it back. So what's the difference here? What's this differentiation? To which they answer, and we'll stop with this for today because we're going to have some questions on this also. But really the lova admits, but what's the concern? And then this is going to raise all sorts of questions, so don't worry if you're left with questions. If the lova says you're right, okay, I come and say I borrowed money, I didn't pay it back, and the document says Nisan, but maybe the loan only happened in Tishrei, and I just don't remember. Who remembers exactly when it happened? This could be a loan from 5 years ago. So I don't remember. Now, the law is that if it's lien to property, it goes from the date written in the document. But maybe the document was written in Nisan, but the loan actually only took place in Tishrei, which means you can only collect from Tishrei. So if the Beit Din goes to collect from Nisan, they're going to collect property from people not legally. The only thing they could do is collect from me directly. Well, that would only be if it's not lien to property. And that's why we have this differentiation. Gemara is going to ask all sorts of questions on this. We'll get back to that tomorrow. Okay, quick review of our daf. We started with the issue of dad acher machna and the problem with the get, where it's dad acher machna and yet she needs to be standing there, when we said you don't need anyone standing there, and we resolved that. We talked about the question of going through the airspace. We didn't have an answer to that. We tried to, but it wasn't successful. We went to this split cases between who gets to keep their own lost item, who has to give it back. We started with the Katan and Shmuel, assuming that a child does not acquire anything by Torah law. We raised a question from leket, and we had 3 different ways to resolve that problem. Then we moved on to what's an Eved Ivri. Why is he different than a Poel? And then we had 3 resolutions to the contradiction there. We went to a shipcha. What is the case of a shipcha where it would go to herself? In the end, it really never goes to herself. It really just goes to the father. We went to the Metzia Isha, who he divorces. Why does the Mishna need to tell us that? Obviously, it goes to her. And we said, well, it's a maybe she's divorced case where the husband's still supporting her. And then, and by the way, I forgot to mention the Katan. We had Shmuel, but we also had Rabbi Yochanan, who thought that was quoted by someone else as saying that a Katan doesn't really mean a Katan. It means someone who's supported by the father. If you're supported by the father, it goes to the father. If you're not, and it has nothing to do with a Katan at all. And then we moved on to this Mishna about finding promissory notes. Who does it go back to? And we haven't really understood fully what's going on there. We'll get to that issue much more tomorrow and in the coming days. Wishing everybody a good day and a Chodesh Tov, and we'll see you tomorrow.